This video is designed to cover Module 5 in our class. This module includes biomes, populations and communities, evolution, and biodiversity. To understand biodiversity and living systems, you have to understand what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is an area where organisms interact with each other and with their environment. They're interacting with other species, communities, and populations, as well as the abiotic and biotic factors of their environment. Ecosystems are part of the interlocking pieces of the larger biosphere, and that can be found in ecospheres, which is the living, breathing part of the earth, in the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, or the atmosphere. Hear me talk in this video about biomes and life zones. They are two different things. Biomes are associated with terrestrial areas that share common climate, precipitation, and organism types. These are the land-based ones that you're most familiar with. And it's typically broken into 7 categories based on those characteristics and their geographic location. Life zones are aquatic, and they share common characteristics such as the organisms and the salinity components of their water. And they're typically broken into 3 separate categories: marine life zones, freshwater life zones, and estuary life zones. Shows you the location of the major terrestrial biomes on the planet. I've also provided a list for you that looks at the biomes from the poles toward the equator. We're going to talk through those very briefly. Let's begin at the poles. The North and South Pole is made up entirely of tundra, also known as a cold desert. The tundra is identified by low precipitation and very low temperatures. While the tundra is covered mostly with ice and snow, it also has this area called a permafrost. It is an area of ice and snow that is continuously frozen. Underneath it, you have small grasses and organisms, especially bacteria, that can live in these extreme cold temperatures. One of the problems associated with the loss of our ice caps at the poles is the fact that once this permafrost melts, large amounts of captured methane from that area under the permafrost can be released into the atmosphere. And we know that methane is a greenhouse gas. So, in addition to losing our albedo and our reflectivity, we're also releasing additional gases into the atmosphere that are going to make it harder for us to regulate climate change. As we move further south from the poles, we're going to experience the taiga, or the boreal forest. The boreal forest is also found at high altitudes and is made up largely of coniferous trees, evergreens. As you move further south, you will start reaching your temperate forests. The temperate forest can either be coniferous, having evergreens, or deciduous trees. The temperate forests are identified as having clear, distinct seasons, and it's more common and easier to understand when you look at a deciduous forest because they drop their leaves in the fall, they go bare over the winter, they bud in the spring, and they bloom in the summer. As you move further down and you start moving kind of laterally here, you're going to experience grasslands or savannas. These are two different types of ecosystems that share characteristics except for one. A grassland is what you might find in the United States. You know, your Midwestern, Iowa, Indiana, all of those flat areas. Grasslands cannot support trees. Their soil is not stable enough to support something that large. However, savannas can. Savannas can support small trees. So when you think grassland, think Midwestern U.S. When you think savanna, think the Lion King, because you find your savannas in Africa. You will have these areas called a chaparral. It's also known as a Mediterranean scrub forest. And they're typically located on the edges of desert, transitional areas between vegetated areas and deserts. And they have these kind of small, hardy scrub-like trees and shrubs. Lastly, around that area at the 30-degree mark, north or south, you're going to find deserts. These are your hot deserts. These are indicated by low precipitation and extreme temperature changes. In the desert, it will be very, very hot during the day, and it can become very, very cold at night. So these extreme temperature changes are what really define this kind of desert. And lastly, at the equator, you have the tropical rainforest, which is associated with high temperatures and high precipitation. Of the two major aquatic life zones that you should be familiar with. The one on the left shows an ocean life zone, or a marine life zone. The one on the right shows a freshwater lake. For the aquatic life zone, the major areas that you need to be familiar with are the intertidal zone, the pelagic zone, the photic, and the aphotic zones. The intertidal zone is found between the areas of high tide and low tide. It is one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. The pelagic zone is what we consider the open ocean. The pelagic zone is subdivided into the photic and aphotic zones. The photic zone is where sunlight is able to penetrate the water, and this is where all of your photosynthetic activity happens in the ocean. The aphotic zone is the area where light cannot penetrate, and it will move all the way down to the abyssal and hadal zones, where there is no light, and you're going to find organisms like the anglerfish. In lake life zones, you have two major areas you should be familiar with. The littoral zone, which is the area on the edge where the bank and the water meet, and the limnetic zone, which is the open water. It's important to note that lake ecosystems undergo this process called overturn. Overturn occurs in the spring and the fall. It's associated with the mixing of warm and cold water that settles out between the summer and the winter. In the summer, the surface of the lake is warm and the lower portions are cold. In the winter, the upper portions are cold and the lower portions are warm. During spring and fall, you have upwelling that causes these two temperatures to mix and allows nutrients to move from the bottom of the lake to the top. The third aquatic life zone, the estuary. Estuaries in this case can be made up of areas such as mangrove forests, or simply an area where freshwater and saltwater meet. Estuaries are also known as ecotones. This is because the overlap of two different ecosystems produces a brand new ecosystem in which some organisms are found where they are not found anywhere else. Identify the areas in which organisms live, let's talk about how they interact with those areas and can become better suited to live in an environment. One of the things we need to talk about are the basic mechanisms of evolution and adaptation. When we talk about evolution, we're talking about the change in allele frequency in a population over time. Remember that an allele is just a form of a gene. Genes can give you information about eye color. A specific allele would be the eye color blue. So we're looking at the shifts in those alleles over a period of time in a population. We can understand these genetics in terms of genotype, or the different combination of specific genes that an organism can have. Or we can look at it in terms of their phenotype. What is the physical characteristic that we see that is determined by those genetics? And we can talk about information and genes in terms of being dominant or recessive. Dominant genes are those that require only one copy to be expressed. Recessive genes require two copies or two alleles in order to be expressed. When we talk about evolution and adaptation, it is important for you to remember an individual does not evolve, a population does. This specific diagram shows you how genetics inform genotypes and phenotypes. When we talk about genotypes, we typically use one of three phrases: homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Homozygous means two of the same. Heterozygous means two different. So a homozygous dominant individual is one who has 2 copies of the dominant allele, while a homozygous recessive individual is one who has 2 copies of the recessive alleles. Remember, evolution is the change in the frequency of alleles in a population over a given period of time. Go back to understanding population and reproductive practices. Our selected species have shorter generation times, which means they evolve much more quickly. This is why the majority of organisms that go extinct on this planet are case-selected, because they have longer generation times, and it requires much more time in order for them to be able to evolve and adapt to a new environment. So once we understand that evolution is the change in the frequencies of alleles in a population over time, and that we can understand those alleles by looking at the phenotypes, the physical expression, how do we then understand how evolution happens in an ecosystem? The major factor affecting evolution is what's called natural selection. Natural selection was first proposed by Charles Darwin after his research in the Galapagos Islands on the HMS Beagle. In general, natural selection works on phenotypes. It works on the physical expression of the genes. Phenotypes that are better adapted to an environment or provide a survival advantage become more common. And because that phenotype is determined by a genotype, those genetics become more common, and it changes the genetic frequencies or the allele frequencies in the population. For example, let's look at this diagram that you have on the left. You see 3 birds. Those birds like to eat green beetles. As green beetles become eaten more often by those birds, there are fewer and fewer green beetles to reproduce and produce green beetle babies. The orange beetles survive, and because the orange beetles survive and are not eaten, they become the dominant organism within that population. Their genes have made it to the next generation. Natural selection is sometimes called survival of the fittest. And it's important for you to understand what fitness means in terms of biology. Survival of the fittest is not the survival of the one who can fight and is the strongest. That has nothing to do with being fit in a biological sense. An organism is considered fit when it survives and reproduces. And that reproduced offspring has to be viable. It has to be able to survive and reproduce on its own. If an organism cannot produce viable offspring, it's not considered biologically fit. So now that we've understood how natural selection occurs and what a fit organism is, let's talk about how evolution and natural selection impact a species. A species is a group of similar organisms that are able to mate and reproduce viable offspring. Remember, the viable offspring is identified as an offspring that can survive to adulthood and reproduce on its own. If an organism cannot survive to adulthood and cannot reproduce, it is not considered a viable offspring. But when a species produces viable offspring, you can get this process of evolutionary speciation, or the development of 1 or 2 new species from a parent species. Speciation occurs typically in one of 2 ways. Through sympatric speciation, which is behavioral or reproductive separation, when members of the same species begin to behave differently, such as being awake at different times of the day, or are genetically incapable of reproducing. Allopatric speciation is geographic separation, where 2 populations of the same species are separated geographically for a long enough time that when they come back together, they cannot reproduce. In order for speciation to have occurred, the 2 new species have to be genetically different enough that they cannot reproduce and produce viable offspring. In addition to speciation, you have different types of evolution that are occurring. Divergent evolution is speciation. Convergent evolution occurs when 2 species follow an evolutionary pathway that lead them to become more similar. Sometimes they may be able to become a same species or a subspecies of the larger species. You also have parallel evolution, in which 2 organisms develop the same characteristics based on the same environmental pressures, even though they are not related in any way at all. For example, birds and bats have parallel evolution because they both developed wings under the same circumstances, even though birds and bats are not closely related to each other. You also have coevolution. Coevolution is a big component that we talked about with agriculture when we discussed the pesticide treadmill. Coevolution occurs when two organisms are within a symbiotic relationship, most often a predator-prey relationship, in which the prey develops abilities to survive the predator. The predator must then adapt to overcome that ability of the prey. The prey then develops new tactics, and the predator has to develop a counter tactic. Coevolution is one of the major components that drives the way that organisms behave in ecosystems. Biogeography is a component of evolution, and it's part of speciation. Island biogeography looks at the interaction between immigration and extinction between mainlands and nearby islands. It also takes into account the size of the island. If you look at graph A on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the island area effect. One of the things to notice is that extinction rate is much higher on small islands rather than large islands. But the rate of immigration is typically decreasing as we move through numbers of species. If you look at graph B, island distance effect, we notice that the immigration rate is much higher for areas that are near rather than areas that are far. So what does this tell us? This tells us that islands that are near a mainland are going to have larger immigration rates and number of species, and if they are large islands, are typically going to be pretty biodiverse. However, if the island nearby is small, you're going to have higher rates of extinction. You also have ideas of these organisms moving from one island to the next. Typically, you're going to see organisms on the nearest islands being most similar to organisms that live on the mainland. Organisms that have moved to further islands are going to be more different because they've undergone evolution and, in some cases, speciation. Okay, so we understand ecosystems. We understand how evolution impacts the way that species are able to adapt. But how do we understand the characteristics that determine where an organism lives? The major thing that determines where an organism lives is its zone of tolerance. The zone of tolerance is the collection of environmental characteristics such as temperature, water salinity, pH, and available food and habitat that makes it available for an organism to survive and function at its highest possible rate. If you notice the graph on the right of your screen, you'll see a typical bell curve. The center of that bell curve is the optimum zone, is the peak of its zone of tolerance. At that point, the organism will survive at its maximum capacity. If we move further to the left or to the right of that optimal zone, we're typically going to find zones of stress. These are areas that are slightly outside the zone of tolerance, but an organism can handle. Further than that, you get the zone of intolerance. These are conditions that are not conducive to that organism surviving, which can often lead to it either dying, migrating, or going through the process of population evolution. Every organism has a zone of tolerance. Every organism also has a niche, or an area within the ecosystem in which it can live and perform its function. We know that there are two basic kinds of species, specialists and generalists. Specialist species have a much narrow niche and have a much more narrow zone of tolerance. Generalist species have very broad niches and very broad zones of tolerance. What we know is that when two organisms have niches that overlap, we encounter competition. That competition often comes in the form of resource partitioning or competitive exclusion. Resource partitioning occurs when the two organisms divide up the materials or divide up the resources in that overlapping niche. So perhaps one organism may eat leaves from the tops of the trees because they're tall enough to reach it, while other organisms will eat leaves from the lower portions of the trees. They're still getting what they need, but they are having overlapping niches. they partition or separate the resources so both of them get what they need. More often, however, you're going to have competitive exclusion, where two organisms with overlapping niches compete to the point at which one organism is completely pushed out of the ecosystem. Diversity is the measure of the number and types of organisms or components in a particular area. Biodiversity is important because the more variety of organisms, ecosystems, and genetics that you have in an area, the more likely you are for that area to survive catastrophic events. There are three types of biodiversity: ecosystem, species, and genetic. Ecosystem biodiversity is simply the various types of ecosystems you have in one place. Species biodiversity is the number of species that you have in a particular area. And genetic is the variation in genetics. How many different alleles or allele combinations do you have in your ecosystems or in your organisms? It's important to understand all of these because all three types of biodiversity play a part in understanding how our ecosystems function and how we can maintain the ability of our ecosystems to survive through the catastrophic events that are occurring naturally and through human impact. When we talk about biodiversity, we're not just talking about different numbers. We're also talking about the ratio of those individuals, genes, or ecosystems to each other. So we're looking not just at number, we're looking also at evenness and richness, which are two things we'll talk about in just a moment. Evenness and richness are two ways in which we can look at biodiversity. Evenness is the distribution of different organisms in ratio to each other. So a biodiversity measure of high evenness means that there's roughly the same number of all of organisms in that particular area. For example, you see here that we have 3 different species indicated, and a high evenness means that there's typically a common same number of those organisms in that particular population. Species richness is looking specifically at just the number of organisms that are there. It is possible for something to be high in evenness as well as high in richness. We're looking at approximately the same numbers as well as large numbers of those organisms. It's important to note that just because there's a large number of organisms doesn't necessarily mean that there's a high biodiversity in an area. Biodiversity takes into account the number of different organisms, the ratio of those organisms to each other, and the number of individuals of each population. So as you see here on the right, you'll see 2 different diagrams. The first, diagram A, shows you low species evenness and low biodiversity because it is dominated by one particular type of tree. Diagram B shows you high species evenness and high biodiversity measures because there are multiple different types of trees and they are approximately the same in terms of their number. Biodiversity, species evenness, and richness are typically measured by one of 2 things, either the Shannon-Weiner index or the Lincoln index. For the AP exam, you will not have to calculate these. It's important to just know that the Shannon-Wiener and the Lincoln Index are associated with measuring biodiversity in populations and ecosystems. The characteristics that affect biodiversity. We can either increase or decrease biodiversity by the choices that we make. An increased biodiversity comes from having physically diverse habitats that have some moderate environmental disturbances, such as seasonal wildfires or seasonal flooding. There's small variation in the environmental conditions, meaning that we typically have pretty consistent precipitation, pretty consistent temperatures. It's typically in the middle stages of ecological succession. Remember, this is that primary succession piece when we're moving from bare rock into our climax community. Around the middle of that, the transition from those hardy grasses into the shrubs and early trees are going to be areas of highest biodiversity. And we allow evolution to occur naturally. Decreasing biodiversity comes from large amounts of environmental stress, large environmental disturbances that destroy major pieces of the ecosystem, extreme conditions where it's very hard to tell whether it's going to be hot or cold, severe limitations of an essential resource, taking away those factors that allow them to reproduce and survive, the introduction of non-native species, and geographic isolation. All of those things impact biodiversity negatively. I mentioned non-native species. What are those? Non-native species are organisms that are found in areas that are not their natural habitat. They are not indigenous. An example of a non-native species would be, if you look on the left of your PowerPoint here, you'll see a European red squirrel found in Europe. You'll also see a gray squirrel that is commonly found in the United States. However, the picture of the gray squirrel that you see was not taken in North America. It was taken in Europe. The gray American squirrel is a non-native species in Europe. However, it is not considered invasive. An invasive species is a very specific type of non-native species. It is not indigenous. It has no natural predator in the ecosystem. And it outcompetes native species, most often because it reproduces much more quickly. An example of an invasive species is the stink bug. You can also find invasive species in pythons in Florida, kudzu along the southeast of the United States, and cane toads in Australia. The important thing to remember here is that all invasive species are non-native, but not all non-native species are invasive. How do humans negatively impact biodiversity? Well, we've got a couple charts here that will talk about that. So humans use agriculture, forestry, fishing, urbanization, and manufacturing. Those are parts of our society that we require in order to survive. But the problem is, those activities cause massive habitat alteration and destruction, causes overharvesting, pollution, adds things to the ecosystem that it cannot sustain, and leads to massive amounts of global climate change. Every minute, 28 hectares of forests are lost across the globe. Half of the world's wetlands are lost. 80% of grasslands in the world are suffering from soil degradation because they are being used extensively for agriculture. And 20% of the dry areas on the planet are in danger of becoming deserts that cannot be reclaimed. Human activity in terms of resource use, expansion, waste, and pollution are major components to reducing ecosystem, genetic, and species biodiversity globally. that humans impact biodiversity loss is habitat loss, specifically habitat fragmentation and edge effect. In habitat loss, what happens is you have a typical habitat that has edges and a center. The majority of organisms live near the center of the habitat because that is where the resources are typically most abundant. The edges provide a buffer between the habitat and areas around it. Humans can impact this in one of two ways. They can cause edge effect, where they encroach upon the habitat so much that the habitat begins to shrink to where the interior portion where the organisms can live is much smaller compared to the edges, which means there's more interaction with the outside world than there is inside, which can cause massive organism drops. We can also cause habitat fragmentation, which separates two or more pieces of the habitat from each other, which can lead to geographic isolation and speciation. It's also important to note that habitat loss is associated with almost every act that human beings use: gathering resources, agriculture, urbanization, recreation. We demolish habitats more rapidly than any other species or any other organism on this planet, which leads to endangerment and extinction of these organisms. And a lot of this can be tied back to either habitat loss or climate change. About organism endangerment and extinction. There are three different types of extinction: local, biological, and genetic. Local extinction occurs when an organism is no longer found in a specific area. That does not mean it's not found anywhere else on the planet, it's just not found in that area. Biological extinction occurs when the organism is present in so few numbers that it cannot perform its function in the ecosystem. And then there's genetic extinction, where the organism is no longer found anywhere on the planet. You'll also see the ways in which organisms are identified as being endangered or critically endangered. It's important to be familiar with these particular characteristics and categories. Organisms that are of least concern are those that are abundant enough that they are able to exist in their natural ecosystems. They have appropriate genetic biodiversity, and they are able to do their function in the ecosystem. Organisms can then move to near threatened, which moves them then into the threatened category. Within threatened, there are three different levels. You can be vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. Above the threatened, there's one of two things you can be. You can be extinct in the wild, meaning that you exist only in reserves and zoos that are maintained, or you're completely extinct. So how else do humans impact biodiversity negatively? This is probably my biggest pet peeve, so bear with me. One of the things that humans do is engage in sport hunting. And some of you may not be familiar with what sport hunting is. Sport hunting is very different than hunting for the purpose of finding an animal and using it for its meat, eating it, using its hide, using its bones, whatever you're going to do it with. Hunting for the purpose of food is one thing, especially if it's done in a way that sustains a population so that it does not overcrowd its ecosystem. Sport hunting is hunting for the sole purpose of trophies, and it is largely associated with endangered species. People will pay tens of thousands and millions of dollars to go to Africa and to hunt an organism that is critically endangered for the sole purpose of having their picture taken next to it and taking home its head to be stuffed and put on their wall. Sport hunting is one of the reasons that large amounts of our African mammals are going extinct. It's not just because of climate change. It's because of sport hunting and it's because of poaching. These activities are selfish and they are a detriment to everybody on this planet who deserves to be able to see these organisms living in the wild the way that they're supposed to. So we've talked about all the bad things that humans do when it comes to biodiversity. Let's throw humans a bone and talk about the good things that they do. One of the major things that humans do positively for biodiversity, especially for organisms that are on that endangered list, is captive breeding programs. These are often associated with zoos, where the organisms are maintained and either naturally or artificially reproduce. The goal is to make sure that you have more of these organisms in the hopes that eventually you can put them back in their natural environment. One of the problems with captive breeding programs, though, is low genetic biodiversity, inbreeding. So it's very important that you have organisms from various different places to be able to reproduce. That's why when you have pandas in zoos who are reproducing, they ship a panda from Asia to reproduce with the panda in the zoo so that you have some genetic biodiversity. We also take on conservation projects through forming preserves, reserves, and zoos. When done properly, a zoo can help maintain an organism from extinction. I said when zoos are done properly. In order for an organism to be safe and healthy, they need adequate space, adequate food, adequate stimulation, and adequate interaction with other organisms of their own kind. When any of these things is not done, the zoo is no longer for the benefit of the animals. The zoo is for the benefit of the humans making the money on the zoo. So, do I like going to the zoo? Absolutely. I love the North Carolina Zoo. The North Carolina Zoo is an amazing accredited program that takes very good care of its animals. Now, this is the end of our course. At this point, you have covered everything from geography and geology to understanding the evolution of organisms in a particular ecosystem. The goal of this course, the goal of this final unit talking about how humans can positively impact our planet, is all designed to make you a more sustainable and conscientious member of society. Remember what Aldo Leopold says. Don't do anything to your environment that you wouldn't do to yourself. We are not the top of the mountain. We are just a small piece of it.